which next year will be 250 years since it was released. We're going to go from the Declaration to Lincoln's first inaugural. That's the first room to set the stage for war. And then the second room will really be about the war and putting Franklin in the context of the Western theater. However, not to disappoint anyone, the thrust of the exhibit in the museum is not the Battle of Franklin. The reason? That's what we do every day of the week. We talk about the Battle of Franklin 7 days a week, 6 to 10 times a day. And that is really where the interpretation is at. So there'll be some, but really it's about placing all of this in the context of the Civil War, but also of 19th century America. And then on the back end, there's a whole series of things about the Reconstruction era and really bridging it to today and why any of this matters, which is a question that I've been putting out to people for a long time. Why does this matter? Why do we talk about the Civil War? And I think there isn't just one answer, but it is all, extraordinarily important. It certainly impacts our lives. I said to someone last week, we live in the United States. And that was in question in the 1860s, whether the United States would survive. So those are kind of the big questions that we throw out. So Jay said I have to introduce myself because we're doing a live stream. Are you ready? Are we live streaming?
I've been ready.
All right.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. So I'm Eric Jacobson. I'm the CEO of the Battle of Franklin Trust, and I'm only here because Tom Price canceled on y'all. Tom's the director of the Murray County Archives. He emailed me a week and a half ago and had a family situation that required him to go upstate New York. So I'm here to fill in his shoes, but it's the perfect time to do a battlefield tour. And actually, Tom, not being here today, solved the problem we had in December. So he'll be here on the second Sunday in December to talk about Murray County's role in the Civil War, and certainly there'll be something about Rippavilla for that. So if you're ready, I am. We're going to do everything we can to keep this to 60 minutes because I have somewhere else I need to be. However, 60 minutes is a crucial component of the Battle of Franklin. Much of what we know about the battle, the bulk of the casualties, some of the greatest recollections and memories of the battle, unfolded in the first 60 minutes. We talk about a battle that lasted 3, 4, or 5 hours, depending on where you are and what you're talking about. But so much happened in the first 60 minutes of the battle from 4 to 5 o'clock. So keep that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about what happened the day before. I said we're going to talk about Spring Hill. Everything about Franklin is because of the failures of the Confederate High Command at Spring Hill and the efforts of John Schofield and the Federal Army to escape. In a nutshell, when I started writing years ago, which led to my first book, I was very curious to try and determine how Spring Hill unfolded, because I wanted to get a sense of why John Bell Hood did what he did on November 30th, 1864. Because if you looked at it just in a vacuum at that time, that single day, and I think everyone, being a member of a round table has read something about it, you've been on tour, it doesn't seem to make much sense, right? You look at it and you say, how could he do this? Well, I turned that around right away and said, well, then why did Lee attack on the third day at Gettysburg? Why did Grant attack at Cold Harbor? Why? I had a list that was, like a Christmas list. Somehow Hood and his decision was placed in, I thought, an entirely different environment, so I wanted to understand Spring Hill. There were all sorts of rumors and myths. I'm sure you've heard them all, and everything from drugs to alcohol and this, that, and the other thing. What happened in Spring Hill on the Confederate side was human error, human mistakes. I'm assuming most of you either had breakfast, lunch, or both today, right? Nobody was shooting at you today or yesterday or for the last 3.5 years. Do you have dysentery? Are you missing a limb? Have you watched your friends die over the last 2 or 3 years? I say this somewhat in jest, but it's the truth. These soldiers, for the most part on both sides, and particularly the Confederate side, were worn physically and emotionally by 3.5 years of war. It's easy to sit behind a keyboard or go to a meeting and say, well, it should have been this way, and he should have done this, and I can't believe he didn't do that. Well, what do you know? What do I know? I didn't live through that, so I was trying to figure out really why. Mistakes. All of us are old enough to remember 9/11, or we knew somebody who remembered Pearl Harbor. With those mistakes, they weren't just events. In hindsight, they were grave errors. There were reasons those errors were made, because human beings make mistakes. And once the cat's out of the bag, you usually can't get it back. The Confederate Army came this close to cutting the Columbia Pike at Spring Hill and blocking John Schofield's route of not just retreat, but escape. It didn't happen. Now, we have no idea what would have happened had they blocked the road, other than we know this doesn't happen here. Something happens down there. We'll never know. Just like we'll never know what would have happened in Pennsylvania had Jeb Stuart not been running around doing whatever he was doing, which drew Lee into a fight he didn't want. That's the land of what ifs. We deal in facts, and all we know is that what happened there allowed, in my opinion, the greatest single escape of the American Civil War, because you can focus solely on the Confederates, and there's plenty to focus on. But what the Federal Army did that night in escaping was itself quite an achievement. John Schofield and all of his troops buckled up and marched all that late afternoon and into the night and all night until they began to arrive here. That army moved almost 30 miles in 15 hours on the night of New Moon, and moving everything that an army needs, wagons, horses, mules, artillery, all up that road. And I just realized as I'm telling this story, I can actually see the road. I can see it. And if you would have been here on the morning of November 30th, you could have stood right here, and you could have watched guys in blue come up that road for 6.5 hours. They didn't just drop in here, parachuting in. They were humping up that road. The back end of the army was at Thompson Station when Jacob Cox arrived here with John Schofield and took the Carter House as headquarters. It was hours before the back end of the army arrived. And when the back end of the army arrived, the main part of the army had already set up a very solid defensive line just south of here. You can really see it, can't you? It is something of a hill. We know it drops down there. It drops down that way, but you can also see the grade now, right? If you've been to Gettysburg, what struck me just the other day was how much this ground looks like what's right in front of Seminary Ridge at Gettysburg. It doesn't look all that impressive till you're standing out there and you're looking up that slope. But if you're on this side, it was a good position. And the Federal troops spent all morning digging in. And then a secondary line was created, new troops. And then Wagner's division arrives, and Wagner places 2 units out front, 3rd Brigade just to the north, which we'll touch on in a bit. That sets the stage for the battle. So what we're going to do is we're going to go after the loudest responders in the country, other than New York City, get past us. I'm not kidding. It's so much like New York. We're going to go as far south as the recent reclamation. And then we're going to work our way following the Confederate advance all the way up to the high point, to 5 o'clock, which was the first lull in the battle, 60 minutes into one of the most ferocious fights of the war. So if you're ready, I'm just going to let you walk the way you want. Eventually you're going to see me, and you're going to have to follow me to a corner at Granbury and Columbia, and we'll meet down there in a couple of minutes. You guys got your tickets?
The guy said that we could pay.
Yeah.
Oh.
You're on the house tour.
Oh.
That's all right. You caught some fun here.
No. Wow, that long. Yeah. Lives in Ashland. She's never been there.
Are you still professoring?
Everyone, I'm going to encourage you to either head toward the pike and follow the edge of the road or move that way because there's a drop off here where this building is. It's not too easy to navigate.
So Eric, what time, and was it Schofield's decision to make this the main line? And what time did they make that decision?
4:30 in the morning.
It was that late?
That early.
Well,
4:30 a.m.
what I meant is late at night. How,
Yeah.
Because it was pitch black, so
Yeah.
how could they, I guess they could feel the terrain?
Well, you know, you stand outside all night, your eyes will adjust enough that you can get a sense of what you're looking at. And this was all open farmland. So, yeah, they saw the house. They could see it sat at the top of a hill. They had just come up the grade,
Which they could feel.
which they could feel.
10 hours of putting up the fortifications. And they just grabbed whatever was around.
Most of the fortifications, to be honest, were put up in about 5 or 6 hours. So I'm going to lead in with that, your question.
Do you know about what time Kimball's men Ford arrived?
About 10 a.m.?
Yeah, because they were way in the back, right?
Yep, about 10. And they were stopped up on Winston Breezy for a bit and then shuffled into place after Ruger and Cox got into place.
That is amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now that was the last exposition. This one came before that one, is that right?
Yes, in order.
It's so strange to see. Your eyes kind of get used to it.
I don't think the library's going anywhere.
Well, you never know.
All right, most everybody in. I want you to do two things. Once I give you some viewshed perspective, I'm going to address a question I was asked on the way about timing. Look that way. You see that truck that just went that way? That's Battle Avenue. It is now open. You can actually see Battle Avenue from the Carter House. That's halfway to Wagner's advanced line. And I think some of you, as you were walking down the road, you can see where the cars sort of go up and then dip down, disappear. That's the ridge Wagner's troops were placed on. Timing. Someone asked, how long did it take to build the earthworks? The main line, also, just to be clear, you might have heard stories about how there were earthworks in this area. That is absolutely false. There was nothing in this area until November 30th, 1864. Here's why. There was no need for any federal troops who were occupying the town in 1863 to build anything out here. And every soldier, every officer who was here on November 30th said they built the earthworks that day. Those two pieces of evidence are good enough for me. There was nothing here. These are veteran troops. They knew what they were doing. The head of the Army arrived at about 4:30. The main line was done by 12 o'clock. They dug that fast. Now, the archaeological dig showed us in various places that the earthworks, they dug a ditch probably 18 to maybe 30 inches deep, right? Threw the dirt up front, grabbed fence rails that were all over the Carter property, threw those on top. The reason they built the earthworks with such speed and made them really kind of this tall, maybe this tall, these are veterans. They don't want to do any more than they have to. And they didn't think there was going to be a battle. The only reason that they stopped here was because John Schofield, as soon as the Army arrived, went down to the river and found out that the bridgehead situation was not good. The rail bridge was functional, but it's a trestle, so they had to plank it. The other bridge was out and it had to be rebuilt. That takes time. This was all basically just a stalling action to buy time for the Army to get up here in total and then evacuate under cover of darkness. And when you look that way, you truly can see, some of you who've lived in this area for a long time remember what this was like before the gym or before the library. But when they built it, they didn't impact this ground. This has been just relatively flat all along. It hasn't changed much at all, and you can see how it starts to rise up. This is this wide open plain that so many of the soldiers recalled, how open the ground was. And it was. There were very few trees out there. It was all farmland, and it's the end of November, so there's no crops in the fields. Whatever they were growing had been harvested or picked. It was wide open. Stalling, delaying, hoping to get out of here. Lines finished by noon. One of the most important components of the pre-battle stage is how the Federal Army, how its final disposition worked out. I'm sure you all have heard something about George Wagner. George Wagner's mistake at Franklin was not in the placement of troops on that ridge. Wagner was the rear guard of the Army. He had been the first into Spring Hill the day before. His unit had absorbed the bulk of the casualties there, and he served as the rear guard the entire way from Spring Hill. He did not leave Spring Hill until 4 o'clock in the morning. His troops marched in rotating line of battle, not column, all morning. They're exhausted by the time they got here, but the orders were the same. Monitor what the Confederates were up to. I'm sure, and I had heard this too, that there was some altercation between he and Emerson Updike about where Updike was to be placed. The evidence doesn't hold up. In fact, Wagner was ordered by 4th Corps Commander David Stanley to relieve Updike and place him in reserve. That's why Updike ends up back there. That's why Updike is so far away from the main line, and that's why Updike's men were in no sort of formation whatsoever. They broke ranks, started to make coffee and make food. They're trying to catch a break. The other two brigades are out front. The mistake, again, isn't placement. The mistake is he spends the entire morning and early afternoon hanging out back here because he doesn't think there's going to be a battle. Neither does Jacob Cox, who's headquartered there. He got orders at 2 o'clock from Schofield that they were going to pull out at 6. They were gone. However, trouble's brewing because the Confederates had arrived. I think the evidence indicates had Wagner been out there with his brigade commanders, who were both veterans, he would have seen with his own eyes what they saw. It wasn't just the Confederates beginning to deploy. The Confederates moved the skirmishers out. The skirmish line advancing was a sign that something else might be in play. And that something was a full-throttled attack. When John Bell Hood got here, and God knows through the years, I've not tried to be a Hood defender, but the whole story of Franklin had been so warped and so distorted. I remember, as some of you probably do, what this looked like years ago. How many of you remember when it was all covered up? ugh, right? Gross. It looked terrible. Even what was here didn't look good. Much of it was kind of run down, old stuff. And I remember thinking, it's no wonder nobody cares about this, because the story that was told well into the early 2000s was Hood was an idiot, he was on drugs, he murdered his army. Wagner and Updike yelled at each other a little bit, and then the battle happened and 6 Confederate generals died, and oh, it was so terrible, right? Well, who wanted to go see that except for a small number of us like me? But even when I heard it, I was like, God, could there be a story less inspiring than this? This sucks and it's stupid and never should have happened. Thanks. Well, who wants to buy into that? It was just a big waste of time. Except it wasn't. It wasn't that at all. When Hood got here, he could see what was in front of him. He later said they were temporary earthworks. He was right. He would know, since he'd been in the Army 3 years and had attacked earthworks or breastworks. He could see it. You know what else he could see? You asked about Kimball. Jacob Cox's division is east of the road. Thomas Ruger's division's right there. You see where that sign is popping between those cars? Ruger's division is right there. You know where Ruger had come from? The Army of the Potomac. After Gettysburg, he went to New York to clean up after the draft riots. That's a veteran. So are his men. Kimball comes in, forms up on Ruger's right. T.J. Wood's division is across the river. 5,000 cavalry to the east. I said I wasn't going to talk about Forrest, but here we go. Because he's in Hood's ear about flanking them, and Hood at some point, I think, had just about had enough. And I can't, any of us in a similar situation would probably have enough too. At some point, it's like, do you know what happened yesterday? Do you know how that played out? We had all day and it didn't work. We've got about 4 or 5 hours right now, and we're running out of time. And you know what he can see? The wagons are moving across the bridges. They've got cavalry on the flank, they've got infantry north of the river, and they're moving the wagons. Hood knew they were going to leave. When John Bell Hood was part of Robert E. Lee's attack on June 27, 1862, when they attacked the entire 5th Corps, slopping through Boatswain Swamp and then up the high ridge on the other side to knock the Federal troops back. Do you know what Lee saw? Fear. That's what he saw. McClellan was on the run because McClellan couldn't run away fast enough from just about anything, and he didn't want to be there. Lee saw it. He saw the fear. He saw those guys were only holding that position to try and delay him, and so Lee went right at him. You can disagree with that. That's why Hood does what he does. He sees this. He sees the fear. They've run from Pulaski, Columbia, they slipped away at Spring Hill, and now they're going to run from here. If you have anything left in the tank at this stage of the war, you got to go in, and you got to go in hard. The best evidence that I ever uncovered for the decision being made on that side came from men on that side. Nobody on that side ever criticized Hood the way later people did, and very few of the Confederates ever criticized Hood for what he did. They all existed in that moment. And that moment, that Wednesday afternoon, I think was different than any other place. Every place is different, obviously. Many of you have been to Shiloh? What's the thing about Shiloh that really strikes you other than the casualties? What gets you? What do you think about?
It's in the middle of nowhere.
In the middle of nowhere. You know what strikes me? Innocence. Innocence and naivety bleeding into the ground. Like we thought this was just going to be some sort of short little cakewalk, right? We'd go home. Then there's Gettysburg. You know, when Lee, this is Lee, he's been punching everybody right and left for a year. And those Federal troops get backed up, they're on their territory. There's something about that place. There's Fredericksburg, an attack that, you know, I understand why, but even that one I go, boy, that's a tough go. This is November of '64. All that stuff's in the past. Everybody knows what's at stake. Everybody knows who's been reelected. Everybody knows that southern cities across the board have fallen to U.S. troops. Everybody knows that emancipation is on the table and has been for almost 2 years. Everybody knew. The way they view that reality there and there, well, that's a gulf. But everybody knew what was at stake. It took the Confederates almost 3 hours to form up. Nobody on this side is really sure. They're looking. Could you really see much if you were the average infantryman? No. But you knew they were out there. Word had spread. This is the Army of Tennessee. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but not out there. They know what's coming. 3 hours. You know how much time that is to sit and think? It ain't 60 minutes, because that's where we're going in 35 minutes. This has a lead up and a setup that dwarfs the battle. I don't think you can understand this. There for 3 hours waiting for the order. And you've been at Shiloh and Murfreesboro and Perryville and Chickamauga and Chattanooga, and you've been all around Atlanta. And some of these guys, if you added it up, had probably marched on the Confederate side, probably had marched somewhere north of 3,000 miles. Even if you had good shoes, you'd wear those out. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait. Sun's dropping over there, and they're waiting. It's almost like it's a terminal illness. You're just waiting. And then the order comes. 6 divisions, 6 of them. The biggest one in the Army is the one we're going to talk about. John Calvin Brown. Brown was the former commander of the 3rd Tennessee Infantry. His second in command was a fellow Matt Chairs who lived at Rippavilla. They were captured at Fort Donelson. They had sat at Fort Warren. Brown came back, got a brigade command, became a division commander. He took over this division in '64. This was Frank Cheatham's division. And Cheatham and Pat Claiborne had 2 of the best divisions in the Army. I'm not going to say one's better than the other. Claiborne is a little more mythologized because he died. I'll tell you something. Cheatham's division kicked ass all over the place too, everywhere they went. This was a hard-hitting division. Tennessee, South Carolinians, tough soldiers. He had 4 brigades, 4 of them. Some great names. George Washington Gordon is the easiest. Otho Strahl, States Rights Gist, John Carpenter Carter. Gist went all the way back to Fort Sumter. Gist was vehemently opposed to Claiborne's idea of arming slaves, one of the most vocal opponents. Strahl was from the North, a lawyer. Carter was a lawyer. Quite a crew. 3,700 men, 4 brigades, 2 in front, 2 in the rear, stacked up like a double blow on a 2-brigade front. Their brigade would have stretched, see where the curve in the road is? Probably about twice that distance. So that would be a 2-brigade, that's a 1-brigade front. There's another one further to the west, 2 stacked in behind that. East of the road, Claiborne's got 3 brigades. East of Claiborne, French has 2 brigades. East of him, Loring has 3 brigades. On Brown's left flank, Bate. Bate has 3 brigades. Brown's got the biggest one in the Army. There's a reason why Brown and Claiborne were in this position. It wasn't just because they were the best. It was because that was the order of march. A.P. Stewart came in first. He got formed up to the right. The line formed up right to left. The brigade commanders out there are coming apart on the Federal side because they see this. When the skirmishers advanced, as I said, that was a sign. And then all of a sudden, all 6 Confederate divisions began their movement forward. Wagner gave the order to pull back. By the time the courier, who came from there to there, and then that courier went from there back there, it was too late. By the time the courier got out to tell John Lane and Joseph Conrad to immediately withdraw, the Confederate infantry was deploying from column into line. A little known aspect of the battle is that they did not advance. I'm sure you've seen the movie Gettysburg and the great pageantry of the men moving in line of battle. Well, that's actually how they did advance that day. They didn't do that here. The Confederates advanced in column. Why would you advance in column? You expose less of your front. So when you get right at the range of artillery fire, which is about 6,000 feet, which means they probably advanced about a half mile, and then they stopped. And those columns do this in a matter of minutes. I've had people ask me, how long would it take a veteran division like this to go from column into line? Probably 2 or 3 minutes. That's how fast they could do it. That is the moment when everybody out there realizes, oh my God, we cannot pull back. And actually they said, the brigade commanders, that they got the order, but it made no sense to pull back because the enemy was almost on top of them, and then it happens. Then there is an explosion. Up and down the line, particularly 10 guns to the east, but there are 2 guns on Lewisburg Pike. There are 2 guns by the Cotton Gin. There are 4 guns staring down our position. They're firing that way toward the knoll that the Everbright mansion sat on. There's 4 guns that get rolled in behind the secondary line, and there's 4 guns further west, and they're all firing like this. They have a crossfire. Nobody's firing straight. They're firing angled shot. There's also 4 guns up in Granger that start to drop fire. There's 3 dozen guns that are hammering the Confederate advance as soon as they changed from column into line. And then the next 30 to 45 minutes is, I think, one of the most incredible spectacles that maybe ever played out. And a spectacle it was, but it was unbelievably tragic. Levi Schofield, no relation to the commanding general, was an engineer. He had helped stake out the line. He said it was burned into his memory watching this human tidal wave come at them. The first major casualties of the battle unfold out there, and I can happily tell you we have just signed a contract to buy another 1.2 acres of ground. If you go south and you see that like dilapidated like veterinary clinic, we have a contract on that. It's $2.5 million. But we're going to buy that too, because that's where some of the first casualties in this area unfold, because Conrad and Lane decided they weren't going to pull back, so they put up one heck of a fight and delayed both Brown and Claiborne. Meanwhile, Stewart's corps is sweeping past Carnton, slamming into the Federal left, but then the break occurs. Probably 300 to 500 of Wagner's men and a couple of hundred Confederates are killed or wounded right out there. But when the break happened, it was like that. John Schellenberger, who was a company commander in the 64th Ohio, said that when the break occurred, it was like a powder train got lit. Just whoosh, the whole line just collapsed. Both brigades completely buckle under the pressure. This is what Hood wanted, and I think most of you know the answer. Why did Hood want to bust that advanced line as hard and fast as he could? What's the benefit?
Follow them in.
These guys can't fire.
Follow them in. And if you follow them in and get right on their backs, the guys on the main line can't fire. It is a simple old Napoleonic tactic. Sheer, blunt force. And if they're going to leave that line out there, that's a tactical weakness. You run straight into that thing and then you shove it back in the main line. and you take your chances. What's incredible is that it actually worked. And I bet you've never been on a battlefield where somebody has told you that Hood's attack actually worked. It did. And that's where we're going next. Questions?
Did they hold artillery while they were Wagner was retreating?
Did
the North hold artillery?
Oh, absolutely not. Theodore Thomason had 3-inch ordnance rifles. He said he was firing over Wagner's men into the Confederates at 5,000 feet. Imagine being out front when your own artillery comes shrieking in over your heads. The clearance wasn't probably 15 or 20 feet because they had to keep it that low to be able to arc it down and hit the Confederates who were coming out of that low ground. You could feel the shock waves as those shells came over the top of you, pressing down on you. Meanwhile, the Confederate infantry is coming right at your face. Oh, they say you could make movies out of it.
How far behind is SD Lee
A couple of hours.
with most of the artillery?
With most of the artillery, this has always been an interesting point of the battle for me. I'm not going to say it's a what if, but the day before when Hood launched the flanking maneuver, he had left most of Lee's corps and almost all of the Army's artillery in Columbia to act as a diversion, and it worked out. It's just Spring Hill descended into this cascade of failures. The problem is, even if he had all the artillery here, I can point to one famous battle where it just didn't matter. Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee fired, somebody here knows the answer, 150 guns for 2.5 hours? Didn't do a thing, did it? Because artillery, as an offensive weapon, is not very good. Okay, it's a much better defensive weapon, because to be able to drop fire onto an infantry line that's about that wide is not easy. Gettysburg is the prime example. In my opinion, had Hood had all the artillery, it wouldn't have mattered. The only way you could break this line was through an infantry assault. And he did, which is the high point of the battle that we're going to touch on toward the end. Questions? Now we're going to get to do something that, well, no battlefield tour has ever done. Ever. Ever. House built here in 1898. Office building back there built around 2002, 2003. $4 million. House where the grass lot is, little ceramic shop for those who old-timey Franklinites. We bought that, tore it down during COVID. That was $1.2 million. Big, ugly cinder block building where all the debris is, $5 million. And just across Strahl Street, 2 houses, both converted to commercial use, $2.8 million. That's the cost. Strahl Street will be terminated by the city of Franklin somewhere back that way. So traffic that comes down Strahl will have to come through here to Granbury. That road's going to be absorbed into the park, which is great news. And then nobody can park there like they are right now. It'll just be an open park. Parking area will be at the Carter House Visitor Center. But I want everybody to kind of move that way. We're kind of right between those 2 light poles, and we're going to cut through the openings in the fence. I want you to take this moment. Nobody's ever done this on a battlefield tour. And this is walking in the footsteps of the Confederate soldiers in John Brown's division who made this final push. After collapsing the advance line, and from that half mile to where we are standing, I don't know how fast you can run, but I think most of those guys could probably run faster than most of us. It's a couple of minutes. It's literally maybe a couple of minutes. I'm in my 50s and I could probably cover that in 5 minutes. It's not that far. And when somebody's trying to shoot you, I suspect you might be able to pick up the pace. It's just a few minutes. And then, well, as George Gordon himself later said, it was as if hell itself exploded in our faces. But they broke the line. Don't forget that when we get up to right about where the debris is. So let's file like good soldiers to the left, and then advance up toward the debris. Okay, we're gonna stop right here. I want everybody to stop right here. I got one other thing, old story I need to relate to everyone. Actually, this is a good perspective too. You can see the office building, you can see the smokehouse, and you can see the Carter House. I want everyone to really take this in for a minute. There's a couple of things you can see. One, as we get, well, actually you can see it from here. You see the hills in the distance right past the artillery hubs? Many times I wondered how many of these guys, if they could see it, might have been some of their last views on Earth. They could see the hills in the distance. They could see the Yankees on the run. But you know what you also can't see from here? And years ago when we tore down a fence line, part of what was the Carter Garden, I remember being struck with the reality that Todd Carter was actually, he was headed toward his house. He was literally going at the house because his unit was a few hundred yards further west. Todd Carter had no business being where he was, none. He had peeled off and was headed toward the house. And when the sight line opened up, I was like, oh my God, you know, it's really true. But you know what hit me the other day? You can't see Lote's house. Not a single soldier who ever fought here ever mentioned the Lote's house. And we know it was there. The Lotes family was in the basement with the Carters. Well, why didn't they mention it? You couldn't see it. But what you could see was that house and the cotton gin over there and the spectacle both east and west of you. But the Confederates never got much further than that. And the guys who got up there, they were hugging the ground at some point. But now I understand why they never wrote about it. It's because they couldn't see it. They probably had other pressing things to think about. Last thing, just west of here, years ago, City of Franklin Housing Authority tore down those buildings and put up, although taller, nicer buildings. The area I just think is much improved. However, between the demo of those buildings and the construction of those, we were permitted to conduct an archaeological survey there. And one of the more interesting battlefield finds, there were two. One was a line, can I borrow that? It was a line of mini balls. Well, I can't, it's not hard, it's not soft enough. A straight line, probably 25 or 30 feet long. And we must have pulled 30, 35 fired mini balls out of a straight line. I'd never seen anything like it. And I can't prove it, but I know that Ellison Capers, who was the colonel of the 24th South Carolina Brigade, and they were right there, said that they stopped momentarily at the base of the hill, reformed, and charged up. Because having come all this way, there's a lot of disorganization. And these veterans took a moment where all the COs are screaming at everybody, stop, 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 because you've already taken artillery blast, there's infantry fire, you're already taking casualties, you stop momentarily. I think what we found, and every single bullet, every single one was an Enfield. And every one was fired, and every one was almost turned inside out. Meaning they had mushroomed where it hit something, so the top begins to fold and collapse around the bottom, and the bottom looks like it's been pushed up through. I think we found a spot where the 24th South Carolina had stopped, and they took a volley or two from the 72nd Illinois or the 44th Missouri, who both had Enfields. And they just peppered the line, and we found that exact spot. The other thing we found almost in that exact area, there's a 3-inch, a battery of 3-inch guns just west of the smokehouse, a little west of the cannons you see right now, which is where the 20th Ohio, I mean, look at that. Look how foreboding those guns look just sitting right there. but they're not able to fire all that much. There's so much congestion in this area, but the 3-inch guns were. We found exploded 3-inch shells right in that same area. And I start doing the math based on the distance and how fast these shells traveled. And all of a sudden, some of you who've worked for me have heard me tell this story. I was hard-pressed to believe that we were actually finding shells, exploded shells at that range, which was a couple of 100 yards at most. 150 probably. So what's that, 450 feet? 450 feet, is my math right? It's not much. And I thought, oh my God, they were cutting the fuses at about a half a second. You're never supposed to cut the fuse shorter than a second, ever. So I called a guy I knew in Murfreesboro who knew a lot about artillery, and I said, could they cut the fuse to a half a second? This is an exact quote. He said, if your balls are big enough. And I said, you really think they could? He said, yeah, they could. But that shell will be coming apart right at the end of the tube. So you run the risk of blowing the tube. But he said, Eric, you got 3,700 infantry minus a couple of hundred that have been taken out. You're looking at over 3,000 guys coming at you. You're a battery commander. You got 70 or 80 men. Yep, I'd cut the fuse to a half second too. And you're already watching chaos east of the road because the Confederates have started to break through around the gin. Cut the fuse to a half a second. It's no wonder some of the artillerists said you could hear the bones snapping, popping, arms, legs shooting up into the air, all sorts of weird physics at play. Because one body smashes into another, and then people think how romantic and glorious war is. And we're still a few hundred feet from the line. And now as Wagner's men all of a sudden are being pushed back, the main line, remember how we talked about they're trying to hold their fire, hold their fire, hold their fire. Eventually they can't hold their fire and they just open up. So some of the slower guys and the laggards in the rear, if they didn't drop, they got shot down by their own fire. And now 2 full infantry divisions, but particularly Ruger's guys, 50th Ohio, 72nd Illinois, backed up by the 44th Missouri, the 111th Ohio, 107th Illinois. They're just throwing sheets of flame down into Brown's guys. And the Confederates keep moving. You ready? I'd ask you to run, but I don't want anybody to fall down. How fast could you run, seriously, if your life depended on it? What do? You go or do you stop? You know what none of them that I've ever found did? None of the Confederates ever stopped. They never stopped charging until they were shot down or they hit that line.
Did the Federals have repeating rifles?
Not in this area.
Not in this area.
There's a unit out in the advanced line that had some Spencers, so they were probably throwing some fire, but none of the mainline units did.
So how fast could you reload a muzzle loader?
If you were good,
If you're
3
really good.
shots a minute. But when you got 3,000 guys, there's a lot of fire coming out. It's still a lot of lead.
What percentage of casualties did Brown take?
It eventually, number of casualties Brown took, eventually probably close to 40%.
Would all of this have been treeless farmland then? No trees at all?
No, some around the house, but none in this area. It had been farmed for 30 years. Ready? Let's head up the hill.
About as fast as I could go. So will all these trees come down then?
No,
They're leaving.
gonna leave them all. You know, we've left trees all over up there. It's also nice to get under trees,
Yeah.
you know, on a battlefield tour. They also help retain erosion. There's some small stuff that we're gonna get rid of, but none of the big ones. There'll be found anything where the surface material is almost always long gone. This is a good spot. All right, we're going to gather up here. This is where we are going to finish, because I want all of you to be able to make this last trek yourselves. This is a great spot to get a perspective on the town. Where I am, you see the church steeple? The town's right there. Thomas Ruger, when he established his line, in his report, he mentioned creating an abovation. Anybody know what an abovation is? It's a section of the line where instead of being straight, or if it's, whatever angle you're looking at, they take a section of the line and they don't build it straight. They actually stop, and then they create something that looks like that. And it's faced inward. And it's pretty substantial. What it is meant to do is draw enemy soldiers into that abovation, so that if they get up to the point, they can be fired on from 2 or 3 sides. It's like a funnel. You just draw them in, and then you pound on them from right and left. Ruger had learned this because soldiers on both sides had become so adept at building fortifications. And Ruger had been at Gettysburg, where they built some of those exact things. We found one of those, I am fairly certain. You can see the crushed rock, and it sort of terminates, it sort of peters out right there and then picks up again where the garden is. I believe that abovation was right along what was the old property line. It's a death trap. However, the Confederates still broke the main line. I cannot stress this enough. John Bell Hood's attack, the effort of his men, of John Brown's men, and of Pat Cleburne's, 40% when it, but probably Brown's men did was ravaged the main line, far more than ever happened east of the road. The penetration by the Confederate troops on this side was, I believe, the greatest peril for Schofield's army. And here's why. Because of the way the line curves that way, if Brown had pushed as far up as the yard, the top of the hill, all his men had to do, if they had gotten that far, was to turn left, and they would have been firing into the backs of the right of Ruger's division and some of Kimball's men. And by that time, they were being hit by William Bates, who had come in on Brown's left and was smashing into that area and actually ruptured a section of the line there. That's how close this really was. The 50th Ohio was right there. There's the marker. And then you start to see how the line curves right behind that pole and angles around the hill. The 50th Ohio took 50% casualties in probably 5 minutes. Half the regiment was gone. The 72nd Illinois was beaten apart, took almost 50% casualties. Company started peeling out from its left to the right till the whole regiment collapsed. This is a huge hole. It runs all the way from the Cotton Gin to about the modern visitor center. Cleburne has broken through, except Cleburne's dead. And then Granbury's dead. And on Brown's side, Brown's men slammed through, except Brown himself was wounded. He got shot in the thigh. States Rights Gist was shot down. John Carpenter was shot down. Otho Strahl was killed in the fighting. George Gordon actually ended up on the other side of the road and was captured over there. All 4 brigade commanders down. Division commander down. The casualties are mounting. They've blasted through the main line, and then they hit the secondary line. And there's only so much that mortal men can do. The secondary line in that area, on both sides of the cannon, which is meant to represent some of the 20th Ohio, was the 44th Missouri. And I wrote a lot about those guys in my last book. They had been attached to Ruger's division 3 days before the Battle of Franklin. They got shipped down on trains to Columbia, marched all the way up the road, having just gotten to the Army. They're new guys. They're completely in unfamiliar territory. And they are in the worst spot on the battlefield. A.J. Barr, the second in command of the 44th Missouri, said the Confederates attacked them at least 13 times in 45 minutes, which is probably about 4:15 to 5 o'clock. And we're 5 minutes from that 60 minutes that I told you about. The battle has really only just started. But they broke the line. They broke that line, they broke that line, and they created one hell of a problem for the secondary line, which barely hung on. My contention has been for the better part of a decade, if the secondary line did not hold, there is no way Emerson Updike ever seals the breach because he didn't have enough men. In fact, most of Updike's men ended up on that side of the road. It was the 175th Ohio, the 12th and the 16th Kentucky, and the 44th Missouri. Those 4 units alone, 2 of them new, 2 veteran, and throw in the 8th Tennessee, U.S., there were probably 2,500 men on that secondary line who saved the Army. And they saved the Army because Ruger's division had been pummeled, but the secondary line, also from his division with some help from the east side, checked Brown long enough, knocked Cleburne's division to pieces so that Updike could flow in and seal off the last of the breach. There's actually 3 separate things that happen. There's that, there's this, and then Updike moves in essentially to reinforce. Now, we could talk about him all day and his whole save the day thing. This is a guy, if he had an Instagram page, he'd be taking selfies all the time. He loved himself. He didn't save the day. He did his part like everybody else did. But what happened here, finally, you can see it. I mean, you really can. To be able to stand here, I was working my way around the building a few days ago, trying to get my first look at those buildings, which only opened up after we tore down, again, if you've been in Franklin a long time, the old Franklin Flower Shop. I mean, I stood right about where that group is 8 years ago and thought, oh my God, I'm seeing something nobody has seen since 1912. And then I stood back there and I was like, well, that was 1898. So this is like 135 years of super cool, 130 years. And now this. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of fill that has to be brought in. There's still a lot of concrete and steel to haul away. But this is what $15 million and a lot of hard work can do. I think that you cannot understand the American Civil War and its conclusion, especially in the West, which, as some of us like to say, the West went east. Sherman went east all the way to the ocean, and Grant went east to finish Lee off. And George Henry Thomas and John Schofield out here finished off what was left of the Army of Tennessee. The war in the West is where it was won and where it was lost, at least as equal as the Eastern Theater, which has always gotten so much of the attention. But to understand the conclusion of the war is to come here. And I could tell you stories about far more than a normal person should. Guys on both sides and what they did for years after the war, and how many of them really legitimately struggled. They really did. So many of them who were here never seemed either willing or able to describe the sheer ferocity. There were probably at any given few moments between 4 and 5 o'clock, that's the 60 minutes I've been referring to, there were probably close to 20,000 men within our line of sight. And probably about 7,000 of them were dead or wounded. The fighting to the east, and particularly to the west, is not nearly as ferocious as this area. And the guys who came back, both sides years later, you know what they went looking for? The Carter House, the cotton gin. Many were disappointed that the gin was gone. and the cemetery at Carnton. They went to those places. And they were the places most impacted by what happened here. Take that last walk. There were Confederates who got all the way up to those buildings. Some of them even got in the yard before Updike pushed them back. But they didn't get much further than that. So now we do this. And for many years, and I still think this, I would like to believe that some of them would be very happy as you could be at a place of such tragedy and death and destruction, but happy that, well, it's not covered up. And you know what? Every guest who comes here from this moment on won't have to look at that. The longer it goes on, and I don't even like to talk about Pizza Huts and Domino's. It's like trivia for some people or novelty, and I'm like, all it is just a bunch of garbage that we just cleaned up, and I'm so glad it's gone. Last questions.
How wide would, when Updike broke through, the widest, and how many men would he have had, and how wide would it?
Question about Updike. Updike had about 1,500 men. 4 of his regiments were east of the road. There were 3 on this side. I don't think Updike really went beyond the left flank of the 44th Missouri, which was right about there. His guys piled in around the house and the outbuildings because that was where the last breach was. The problem the Federal Army still had, even as Brown's men were throwing themselves up there, was, you know, you could kind of squirt between the buildings and around the farm office, and the road was obviously open, so there was that last sector, and that's what Updike closed up with those units. 24th Wisconsin, that's MacArthur's father fought in that unit. The 125th Ohio, 73rd Illinois, they were the units that, and the 36th Illinois slammed into this area on the west side.
How did it end?
How did it end?
Did they just stop?
At about 7:30, there's another Confederate division to get thrown in, and it just sort of began to naturally just fade. People just stopped pulling the triggers.
Would have been after dark by then.
Oh, absolutely. It was dark by 5. Yeah. Jacob Cox said the first lull in the fighting was about dusk, which had to be between 4:50 and maybe 5:05, 5:10, but it ended organically. By 8 o'clock, John Schofield issued orders to pull the guns off the line. He pulled the artillery off at 8. So if you hear, 5 tragic hours, this didn't last 5 hours. This thing was over in 3.5 hours. There was spasms of fighting, but Schofield knew. That's why he pulled the guns off. And the Federal troops took a couple of hours to catch their breath. They started an evacuation by 11 o'clock, 11:30. They're gone by 2. It was almost, in some ways, and I guess I knew this when I wrote my first book, it's almost clinical what the Federal Army did over 2 days. They barely escaped and they barely hung on. But when they weren't barelying, they were clinically dissecting what was left of the Army. It was almost like they were just pulling it along, like, you know what? Dare you. Try it. Do it. See what happens. And Ruger's guys, those aboviations, that's done with intent, because you know you're going to be able to lay waste to anybody who hits that zone. And that's what these veterans had become. I told a group last week they had become killing machines. They are as close to World War II veterans as anything that's ever walked this continent, because those 2 wars reached a point where it was, well, it's how many of you can we kill before we go home. That's what happens here. Yes, sir.
I assume all through the approach, they can't see the reserve line. It gets us down.
No, well, they couldn't see Updike, but they knew there were 3 lines. That was pretty clear. But I made the point about Gaines Mill. I think Gaines Mill had 5 lines of defense. 5 separate lines stacked up a hill. And Lee still went at it. This is why I love to talk about Hood, because people are like, well, all he ever did was attack. I was like, all his commander ever did was attack. That Lee reveled in being able to get after the enemy. Name a successful, really seriously successful commander in the history of military warfare who was who didn't fight offensively. Alexander the Great, it's all he did. Napoleon, Caesar, I mean, all of them, they attacked because attacking is fear. Scare the enemy. You get into their heads too. The great ones really get into the enemy's head. That's what actually I think made Lee very good, but it also made Grant formidable because Grant loved to attack too. Grant would hit you just hard enough that he'd jar your teeth loose and then do it again. And not back off and do it again. That's why when he and Lee get together, that's like an Ali Frazier fight. Ali Foreman. You know, I mean, you pay for that. But the bloodletting, good Lord. And Hood came right out of that environment. He watched Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee do that over and over and over and over and over again. But you also have to be born with that. Soldiers like that are trained and disciplined, but they're also, you have to want to do it. You know, there's that famous line where Lee at Fredericksburg said, "It's well that war is so terrible, we should grow too fond of it." Who knows whether he ever said it, but if he did, it's true. You have to enjoy the spectacle and the sport of it, or else it would sicken you into submission. And Grant didn't like the sight of blood. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just to build on your point, I just read a book about World War II. Nathan Bedford Forrest had a great-great-grandson who was a brigadier general in the 8th Air Force.
Yes, killed in 45.
43.
43? Yeah, great-grandson.
Because they had they didn't know what to do. The 8th Air Force was desperate, and he said, well, let's just all stack all the planes at the same elevation, because they used to stack them in combat boxes. And he led an attack, and that's what he got killed on. Good, he was looking for a fight.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so the 3 lines, was that, Hood could see that from Winston Hill? Is that how we knew there's 3 lines? And how far north did Hood get to by the end of the night? Did he just stay in Winston Hill?
Oh, Hood?
Hood himself.
Base of the hill. Yeah, there's a house I think he might have stayed at, but I don't have anything positive. But he didn't venture up here. Nobody really did until the morning. And what they saw in the morning was,
They came on first light they came in.
Yep.
So the French
Actually, he was considering another attack, wasn't he?
He was going to go at him in the morning.
Is it true he brought in like his artillery and the
Yep.
wheels wrapped in blankets?
Yep.
Quiet?
Yeah, he was going to attack in the morning. Levi Schofield later said that many of them wanted to stay. Jacob Cox wanted to stay and finish it. Levi Schofield later wrote a letter to Cox and said the Battle of Nashville was fought at Franklin. Meaning, his opinion was Nashville was just a foregone conclusion, just a matter of time, which it was.
2 weeks.
Yep.
Are
Yes.
the books in the visitor center?
I think so. You can probably find it.
I hope so.
Good
What's
guess.
what's your favorite? What?
Closing country.
My favorite book to write was my last one. My first book was not fun to write at all. It's the one that sells the most, but I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what I wanted to do. It took a long time. And I'm actually almost done with a 2-volume history now of Rippavilla and the Chairs family, and I'm actually going to finish my Wagner biography, which I've been working on for years. So I'm going to drop 3 books in like 6 months next year. But yeah, the last one was the most fun to write. The guys in those 2 Ohio units and Missouri unit that I wrote about were like so many men that I grew up with. They weren't Forrest or Lee or Patton or whatever famous name that everybody talked about. They were the guys that actually carried the rifles and fought the battles. Didn't get all the glory. That's why it was fun to write about them. Anything else? Yes, sir.
So most of the federal troops didn't sleep for 2 days?
Most of the federal troops did not sleep for 2 days, and I think the bulk of Wagner's guys hadn't slept in 3 days.
Sheer adrenaline.
Yeah, and consider they were not only just awake for 3 days, but all the marching, and some of them fight in 2 places. Yeah, it was, the bodies gets to a point where it just collapses. And many of them, when they got to Nashville, that's when it happened. Schofield said he got to Nashville at noon on the 1st and slept till sundown on December 2nd. Last one.
This agricultural question, you mentioned the cotton gin. I was always under the impression that good cotton was being grown over by Memphis. And this was most,
True.
these crops here were mostly tobacco and
Yeah.
hemp, right?
Tobacco and really corn and grain. They didn't grow a lot of hemp around here.
okay.
That's a Kentucky thing.
Okay.
Yeah, but they did, some people grew cotton, and you could, but it's better really west of Jackson.
Okay.
It's just a little too cool in the spring, and then gets a little too cool. Like right now, Mississippi's warmer. West Tennessee's warmer. You need that 3, 4, 5 degrees. It's the difference between little and big puffy white ball. But it was very lucrative, so he took a chance. Well, I appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. Take that walk. Take it slowly. You don't have to rush it like they did. Seriously, take it, let it, just think about what actually happened and how hard some of us have worked to save it so that people years from now can just see it. Anybody who works for me knows that I'm not big about awards or getting photographs made or any of that sort of stuff. We're just doing it just 'cause. And that's all that matters. Other people can talk about how the process happened. I wanted to save it, and I want people to see it. That's it. I'm headed south. How about you?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great presentation.